Africa is not a continent in a perpetual state of chaos that many young people believe it to be. These are the words from the descendants of Kenneth Kaunda, Oliver Tambo, Samora Machel, Julius Nyerere, Nelson Mandela, and many others. The children and grandchildren of Africa's liberation heroes were speaking at one of the Russia-Africa Summit side events in St Petersburg. Let's get some reaction now for what this summit, or what has come out of this summit thus far, and we'll speak to Professor John Stremlau, International Relations Division at the University of Witwatersrand. Prof, good morning to you and thank you for your time. Let me first get your sense of how you think this two-day summit has gone thus far.
Well, Toli, thank you for having me, but the comments that you were quoting from the descendants of the great liberation struggles heroes was probably the most positive thing I've heard to come out of the summit so far. Only half of the number of heads of state who showed up in 2019 to the first summit have appeared this time, barely 16 or 17 of the 43 that were in the first summit. So this has been an opportunity for Putin to make the pretense of business as usual, but it's impossible to do that when he's only a week ago rescinded the grain agreement with the Ukrainians that provided at least a dampening effect on the price structure of grain for Africa. And then he's promising a small commitment to a number of African countries of free grain, but they're the Wagner group of countries like the CAR and Mali and Libya and Sudan that have benefited from the mercenaries' presence there, and it's very extractive and it's very transactional, and I just don't think it's as important, frankly, for multipolarity in the geostrategic environment as the BRICS meeting, which South Africa will host in August, and which it hosted the national security advisors, who were much more substantive last week this week, Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday of this week here at Johannesburg.
Prof, let's contrast these two summits. So the first one, if viewers will remember, first one took place in 2019. At that time,
that's right,
there were 43 African heads of state who attended that summit. This time around, the Kremlin says 17 would attend. Does that signal waning influence on the part of Russia?
It signals a frustration on the part of African states, I think, with the transactional nature of Vladimir Putin and the Russians. And the Russians, promised in 2019 to increase trade to $40 billion a year, which is still much, much smaller than the European Union, China, and the U.S. In terms of trade with Africa. And they haven't increased. Indeed, they've cut back from 18 billion, which was in 2019, to 14 billion now. And that's with a handful of countries in North Africa. So they really are not a presence in Africa. The Soviet Union really did help the liberation struggles, of course, and we're reminded of that by the ANC often. But this is Russia now, and it's fighting a neo-colonial war in Ukraine and breaking all the agreements that it signed, both with the United Nations and with the bilateral treaties with Ukraine. So, Vladimir Putin is about as reliable as Donald J. Trump when he speaks.
Prof, then there's something that I picked up, which was quite of interest in the Sunday papers this past weekend. A columnist and editor-in-chief at City Press, Mondli Makanya, he took issue with this collective of African leaders going to, whether it's Russia or China or the United States, going there as a bloc, ostensibly to talk about trade relations as a group of leaders from the African continent. He says, imagine if the president of South Africa invited all the leaders of Asia to Pretoria to make deals with them as a collective, or if the president of Nigeria summoned European leaders to Abuja as a collective. And he says, this plays into the worst racist stereotype about Africa being that big landmass where everybody is the same, looks the same, and behaves the same way. Is there a problem, Professor, with how African leaders should conduct business in the world as a collective? Why would they do that?
This is a very big and complicated subject, and you're right to raise it, and I hope that your viewers will ponder the collective action of African countries, because Martin Kimani, the ambassador of Kenya at the UN, back when they were about to invade, when Russia was about to invade Ukraine, reminded everyone that Africa is a collection of 54 states that have colonially defined frontiers. It needs to get itself integrated, and it speaks with one voice, and it can be much more influential than its separate parts. How that process unfolds seems to me to be critically important, and with Thabo Mbeki's leadership, the African Union did adopt a framework for the continent to work together and to project itself in a constructive way in the geostrategic environment. Now, what we're seeing is a much more diverse geostrategic environment, and the BRICS will address that. And South Africa is a member of the BRICS, but a very small member of the BRICS, only 2% of the BRICS economies. But nevertheless, it is a chance to put pressure on Russia, especially China, for a settlement of this Ukraine war, which is a terrible distraction. The fact that the African leaders were so divided over whether or not to support Ukraine or take and abstain from the votes in the UN was symptomatic to me of division that should not have happened. The Africans should speak on these broad issues with one voice. Mondley is right about the different variations in the continent, of course, but it's not a racist pretension. It's a chance to give Africa greater agency in collective action. Yeah.
Let's then conclude the conversation, Prof. Based on the reports that are coming out of that summit, and of course the media will always look at meetings like this much more critically. I'm looking at the Bloomberg news service here, and they're saying that Putin's attempt to strengthen ties with Africa backfires as leaders critique his role in the escalating global food prices. Do you think that the leaders of Africa could potentially be that bloc that ultimately wins over President Putin in stopping the war in Ukraine?
No, I do not think that's the case. I think that Africa can encourage collective action by India and China to pressure, and as well as the Western countries to pressure Zelensky to get this terrible war behind us and to move on. But I think that you alluded to a very important distinction, Toli, at the beginning of your remarks, which is the freedom of the press. We ought to be, as citizens, debating all of these issues and trying to make our own determination as to what the right or wrong answer is. And of course, we don't have a free press in Russia at all, and nor do you have one in China. But China is different, and at least is receptive to partnering with Africa in ways that are responsive to Africa's priorities and concerns. And I think, ironically, the former colonial powers of Western Europe are, and I think the United States post-Cold War is much more that direction, so long as the Democrats stay in power and not the return to Donald Trump, who would be allied with Putin.
Professor John Stremlau, thank you very much for your time and analysis here. He is from the Department of International Relations at Wits University.